Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that we are on, well, I am here today on the lands of the Kulin Nation, Woiwurrung and Bunurong country, and just to acknowledge elders past, present, and any other Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders joining us today. It's lovely to have you here. And just also to acknowledge that these data centres that we're currently on, they connect us through all different countries. I encourage you to find out what country you are currently on and to hold that as a piece of knowledge. So my name's Amrita Hepi. I am a dancer and choreographer and also a Bundjalung and Ngāpuhi woman. I mostly work, I guess, within the arts sector, so it's refreshing to be here today and be a part of this, interviewing another countrywoman who's also Ngāpuhi. But to be really listening and learning. On behalf of Miles Hutchinson, Sian Baja, and YIPAA Victoria committees, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the opening of the 2020 YIPAA Masterclass Series, the first cab off the rank. I'm really excited that we have Elly Patira to kick off this inaugural Masterclass Series. The program that the YIPAA committee of IPAA Victoria has put together for this 4-week series looks like it will be a really inspiring and incredibly insightful journey for those who are attending all of the other events. So just some housekeeping, please note that today's event will be recorded. Please remain on mute unless you are asking a question, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions later during the event. So you can raise your hand or put questions into the chat. There is a Q&A, and that's how we'll be moderating things today. So if you do have a question, please pop it into the Q&A. We can then vote on it and everybody will be able to see it and be able to manage it a bit more efficiently. Please don't wait to pop your questions in. If something comes to mind, please put it in there as soon as possible. Sometimes, we can forget these things. So just, as soon as you have a question that you'd like to ask, pop it in there. About IPAA, the Institute of Public Administration Australia, Victoria, it's a member-driven organisation which connects, empowers and celebrates Victoria's public purpose sector. Young professionals are a key part of the sector and the YIPAA community is an important part of this. Especially in this unprecedented time, the public sector we know is working incredibly hard. You can be a part of the YIPAA community through your IPAA Victoria membership. Just visit the IPAA Victoria website and in particular the Get Involved page for more information. Events such as these would not be possible without the support of our partners. So to our major partner, the Victorian Public Sector Commission, their new Commissioner, Adam Fennessy, PSM, the former Acting Commissioner, Julia Griffith and the team, thank you for your support. The work that you do across the sector for young professionals is really greatly appreciated. To our supporting partners, the Victorian Managed Insurance Authority, thank you to Andrew Davies and his team for their support of young professionals across the sector, and to Deloitte. Ellen Derrick, Deloitte's National Public Sector and Public Policy Lead, along with Ian Trevora, Deloitte's Victorian Public Sector Lead, and all the team. Thank you for supporting the Masterclass series that we're a part of today, with content for many of the sessions across the month. So now I would just, hello Elly. I would just like to hand over to Kym Peake, President of the IPAA Board. We have a pre-recorded message from Kym. As you can imagine, she is quite busy with this pandemic that we are all in. So over to Kym.
Welcome to the inaugural 2020 YIPAA Masterclass Series. It's a pretty remarkable time to be in the public sector and the broader public purpose sector at the moment, in terms of the disruption to how we work, sometimes helping cut through to improvements much more quickly than our usual processes, but also making it more difficult to have the incidental contact with one another. Everyone is grappling with managing the impact of the virus on themselves, their families, their communities, at the same time as managing time and work really differently. It's okay to sometimes feel frustrated, anxious, or even overwhelmed, and I really hope you're all taking care of yourselves, but also getting different opportunities to contribute and develop new skills. These times really reinforce why the work of the public purpose sector is just so important. To protect people from harm, help people, businesses and communities to respond to the enormous social and economic upheaval from a pandemic, but also to set the tone for how communities come together in a crisis and support longer-term planning to build back better. Hopefully none of us have to experience another period like this in our careers. But in experiencing it, there is so much to learn and reflect on about public purpose leadership, values, governance and delivery. From where I sit, I have seen so much collaboration and willingness to take on new tasks. So many departments, agencies and partners have pitched in without quibbling about professional or programmatic demarcations. There are always lessons to be learned and improvements that can be made. But the commitment and leadership at every level of the Victorian public purpose sector has been and continues to be exceptional. In my mind, kindness is the essential ingredient underlying everything we do as public purpose professionals. At the best of times, but absolutely during times when the community looks to government for direction and support. And representing nearly a third of the whole public sector, your perspectives and efforts during this time have never been so important. At IPAA, we are really committed to both supporting you to navigate this period, but also to continue to build your careers. Even before the pandemic, we were asking ourselves how we could work differently to help our members build capabilities, networks and careers. We've purposely, as part of our strategic refresh, highlighted young people and early career professionals as one of the 5 target cohorts for curated offerings, so that you can better respond to the various key drivers shaping the public purpose sector. We did have an idea last year about providing a new opportunity of a youth summit. The summit would over time become a signature event like our International Women's Day dinner and the state budget breakfast. The YIPAAs embraced these ideas and, being agile in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, the advisory group have curated this inaugural YIPAA Masterclass Series as a first step towards a forum. The purpose of the Masterclass Series is to inspire, motivate and equip early career professionals with the foundational knowledge and skills required for a remarkable career in an ever-changing world. The Masterclass Series theme of change, agency, reflect, anticipate, respond to affect change is certainly topical, particularly in the context of the current public policy challenges arising from COVID-19 and what the new future of the public purpose sector could look like as a result. I saw from your program that you have some incredible topics and wonderful speakers, delving into a range of case studies around technology, policy, people, place and the planet. And I really want to acknowledge and thank Deloitte Australia for their generosity of support in hosting the GovLab workshops, business chemistry workshop and coffee with a change agent during the Masterclass series. I also want to acknowledge Squiggly Careers for hosting the career conversation sessions. I'm really confident that the YIPAA Masterclass series will give you a chance to reflect and connect. Please use it as an opportunity to stand back from the pace and intensity of the pandemic response. And please remember to be kind to yourselves and each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kym. Look, without further ado, we will hand over to Elly Patira. I'm thrilled to be introducing you, Elly. I'll keep this short and sweet. Elly is an Indigenous woman with links to Gunai, South East Victoria and Ngāpuhi country, fellow Ngāpuhi woman from Northern Aotearoa. She's a lawyer, policy advisor with broad experience across constitutional, Indigenous, minority rights law policy, both domestically and internationally. She holds a BA and JD from the University of Melbourne and Masters in International Human Rights Law from the University of Oxford. She's worked in the public and corporate sectors for Aboriginal organisations, within not-for-profits, and as an advisor during the Fijian constitution-making process. She is currently the Executive Director of Aboriginal Affairs Policy and Treaty Branches within the Department of Premier and Cabinet, as well as Founding Director of Australian Lawyers for Remote Aboriginal Rights. There's so much great talks that Elly has already done on really complex topics, and yeah, absolutely thrilled to have you here today. Over to you, Elly.
Thanks, Amrita, and thanks everyone for having me. I'm actually really pleased to be here. I wish there was more of this stuff available, particularly when I was in the early part of my career. And I really encourage and would really enjoy as much as possible, as Amrita said, if this was a discussion. So do feel free to raise topics or issues that you'd like to talk about. I'm really flexible and happy to have those conversations. I will start, as is our custom, by acknowledging country. I want to acknowledge traditional owners, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging on all of the lands that we're meeting on. I think there's a tendency almost for that acknowledgement to have become almost just something we do as part of meetings, but I really want to reflect on how important that is. It might seem like quite a sort of you know, typical process that we go through now in government, but it's really actually it's an incredibly recent addition, this idea of acknowledging country and acknowledging traditional owners. And you know, as recently as the Baillieu government, we had those acknowledgements removed, so that they do resonate, they do have meaning, and they give us all an opportunity to reflect on who we are and where we are. Kym and Amrita have both touched on this, but what a time to be working in the public service. I went to the supermarket yesterday and I just was sort of walking around with my milk carton thinking, if you had told me a year ago that we'd be involved in the drafting of public health directions to essentially, you know, tell us to work from home, to require us to be home except for the 4 reasons we've all become so familiar with, to be wearing a mask, which was really what struck me yesterday when I was at the supermarket, I wouldn't have believed you. And I think it's, as Kym said, it's a really interesting time because there's such rapid decision making going on in government at the moment, and the kind of action that is required in an emergency. And we saw it even yesterday with the significant announcement by the Premier. It really requires, it's absolutely contingent, in fact, upon the agility and the innovation and the responsiveness and the incredible hard work of our public sector. And I think that's a really important thing to reflect on. For me personally, in addition to my roles as an executive, I'm also heading up the Victorian Government's Aboriginal Community COVID-19 Task Force, which I'm happy to make some reflections on later if it's of interest. And I think that role has allowed me to see the opportunity to actually put policy and program responses, to see them implemented in real time, which is, I think, something quite new. Indulge me here as I go off on this tangent, but you know, a couple of Fridays ago, I was working really late at night to advocate for the inclusion of Aboriginal door knockers in the Victorian Government door knocking response. And on Monday morning, I went for a walk really early in the morning and saw that Aboriginal team at the public housing flats that are quite close to my house. So just that you know 3-day turnaround on issues that you're raising, on talking about and seeing them in real time, it really does present an opportunity to work differently. In talking today, you know, this discussion, this masterclass is very much focused on Aboriginal affairs policy and action, but it is very much grounded in the realities of the COVID-19 world, I think, that in which we all find ourselves. And I think it would be odd for me to sit here and describe to you what the impacts are as a result of COVID-19, you know, the fundamental shift in our communities, in the ways that we are working, in our economy, the really significant social upheaval that Kym spoke to. I think these are things that we are all living and experiencing firsthand. So I'm not going to sit here and list them off for you, because I think it's well understood by everyone in attendance. But in making this address, what I have been asked to respond to is, well, what is it that we can learn from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities about resilience, about how you maintain ways of life and governance, and how they might actually inform how we respond more broadly as a community to the kind of social and economic upheaval that COVID-19 has delivered upon us. In reflecting on this question, it was really clear to me the answer to this is really, really complex. It's multi-layered. It's probably beyond even an hour or 2 hour long conversation. Concerned that I wouldn't do it justice, I think what I will do today is try and delve a little deeper into essentially 2 key elements, if you like. For me, the first is a bit of an exploration of Aboriginal resilience, or First Nations resilience more broadly across the globe. And I think when we talk about resilience, it goes without saying that dealing with upheaval, dealing with change is nothing new for First Nations people. The reality is that social and economic impacts from colonisation and ongoing control has accumulated across generations. And yet, despite dispossession, despite child removal, despite economic and educational exclusion, despite racism, First Nations people have not only endured, but they've thrived. So what are the lessons in there for us? We'll delve a little deeper into the sources of First Nations resilience. From my personal perspective, I won't, it'll reflect my lived experience, and I think these are conversations where you'll see lots of different perspectives from lots of different First Nations people, but I hope that this helps to inform some of that conversation. And I think what I'd like to do is think about how we can use an understanding of First Nations resilience to inform and shape our understanding of what are the sort of community characteristics that will be necessary for Victoria to recover from the impacts of COVID-19. And I think that's really relevant for all of us. That said, I think I'm really keen to make sure that we don't just take from Aboriginal culture and knowledge without also thinking about some of the complexities that go with resilience. The second issue I really want to explore, and which in some respects I think is probably an example of Aboriginal resilience, is how Aboriginal Victorians have been able to leverage off the COVID-19 emergency and use it as an opportunity to shine a light on the sort of health inequity that exists in this country, and to advocate for investment in Aboriginal-led approaches and to address inequity across the board. So it's through those 2 sort of lenses, I think, that I'd like to move this conversation forward. If people are happy for me to just keep on moving on, but as I said, do jump in at any point in time, what I might do is turn first to the issue of resilience. And, you know, what do I mean by the term resilience? It means different things to different people. For me, in the broader sense, when I'm talking about resilience, I'm talking about the capacity of an individual or a community to withstand and recover from adversity and from change. So if we take that at its broadest, I think in order to talk about First Nations resilience, I want to spend just a little bit of time, if you will indulge me, setting the context by discussing the social, the political, the cultural and the economic constraints that have really been placed on First Nations people since colonisation, because I think you cannot understand the resilience without understanding some of the adversity. In particular, what I'd like to do is try and build a bit of an understanding here and give a bit of colour and movement to the concept of colonial trauma, because I know a lot of people hear words about intergenerational trauma. First Nations people, as First Nations people, we talk about it a lot, but what does that mean, and how can I give a bit of context to that lived experience? As I said in my introduction, there has just been so many instances of colonial trauma that has been inflicted on First Nations people in this country, from early eradication to dispossession, assimilation, racism. I talked about child removal, the suppression of culture, of ceremony and of language. Really quite profound and incredible. And for me, it's really important to reflect on how it is that we came to this point. The very foundation of Australia, and more relevantly Victoria, was based on the legal fiction of Terra Nullius. Directly translated from Latin, that means nobody's land. Now, to maintain a claim that this country belonged to no one took an absolute concerted effort and a degree of kind of creative rewriting of our history on the behalf of early settlers. And what it required really was the active denial and dismantlement, if you like, of Aboriginal culture, of existing Aboriginal law that existed in this country, and of Aboriginal ownership. And so what we see is that Victoria established early in that period its systems and structures from the outset, systems and structures that persist to this day. I'm talking about our legal system, our justice system, our education system, our economic system. I could go on and on. These were all designed and established with the very specific intent of excluding Aboriginal people and our laws and culture. And I think that's a really important way to shape it. It wasn't actually until 1992, when the Mabo decision came through the High Court, that this concept of Terra Nullius was overturned as a legal fiction. And so what we have interwoven for 200 years is this this kind of very particular creation of our systems and structures to exclude Aboriginal voice. So what does that mean for First Nations people? It means that Aboriginal people have, in a sense, I think, always lived in a perpetual state of emergency since colonisation, fighting to maintain culture. It wasn't just at a point in time and then we've kind of moved forward. There's been a continuous kind of need to fight to maintain culture, connection to country, to reinforce identity and belonging, to be able to support Aboriginal ways of living in the face and needing to operate within systems and structures that weren't informed by Aboriginal views. Not only were they not informed by Aboriginal views, they were actually designed to deny Aboriginal perspectives even existed. For me, what this means, or how I like to conceive of it, is that settler colonialism, it's not just historical, but it's a lived experience that continues to this day. Right now, for all of us in this COVID-19 world, our social, our economic existence has been, our understanding of the world has been entirely upheaved. And we've all been forced to adapt and exist. And I think the well-being issues, the anxiety, the uncertainty about this period of time, the impact on our ability to maintain rituals and traditions, to meet with our families and friends, to maintain our normal way of life, that has a really heavy feeling of constraint. And what I would say is these are relatively minor infractions compared to the sort of impacts of colonisation, but I think it can give you a sliver of insight, if you like, into what the experience might be for a First Nations person living in a world where you can operate, but where you are just under so much pressure to live in a different way. It's certainly not perfect, but I think when you're thinking through Aboriginal policy, if you try and take that mindset and use that COVID-19 comparator, for me, I think it's useful. And I think what's really interesting, what we've seen is that First Nations people, we've sustained ourselves, we've developed and maintained our identity, we've been able to reclaim our culture as well, where it's been lost. And this is all part of a resilience mindset. So if Aboriginal communities are, for better or worse, accustomed to kind of catastrophic change and to adjusting and adapting and to keeping functioning in this world, I suppose the real question is, well, what can we learn from Aboriginal communities? And for me, there's a few different things. And one is that resilience is not something that is inherent to Aboriginal people. I'm fearful that there is a tendency to almost exoticize Aboriginal resilience and to make it somehow part of our cultural identity. For me, resilience is something that has been forged through our common experience of adversity, survival, and hope. There's no doubt about that. And we have shown great resilience, but you learn resilience or you develop resilience in the face of adversity and in the face of change. And so I see it not as something that is inherently Aboriginal. That said, what I do think is that there are community characteristics that have supported resilient responses from Aboriginal people and communities. And I reflected on this over the weekend. What would I say those are? And I think they're anchored in a number of attributes. And I certainly don't think this is necessarily reflects perhaps what a a more careful psychological analysis would turn up, or certainly what experts would find. But I think some really key attributes are around our sense of identity, our cultural beliefs and our knowledge, in the interconnectedness of our people and societies, which just brings such incredible strength, in our connections to the natural landscape, and in our sense of cultural responsibility and obligation. If I pull this apart just a little bit more, I think Aboriginal belief systems, our values and our practices, they centre around interconnectedness between a person's sense of self, their community and country. And these are really intricate relationships. And it means that Aboriginal people are able to sort of clearly identify their place and their belonging in a society, as well as their responsibilities and obligations, as I said, to family, community and country. I think these are important for a few reasons. Firstly, I think it creates a unity of purpose and of identity. Now, having a handle on who you are and what you're doing in the world, I think it does a few things. It supports well-being, absolutely, but it also gives us a collective purpose, and provides a pathway to the future. We have clear relationships and an understanding of our obligations to the next generation. And I think that's absolutely crucial to maintaining and rebuilding social and cultural structures, is this idea of a collective purpose, if you like. Secondly, reflecting on it over the weekend, I think it builds our sort of cultural belief system and values, builds social connectedness and community cohesion. And I think it does this, and I talked about this idea of having very clear cultural values around responsibility and obligation. I think that's really critical because it builds a sense of collaboration and cooperation in achieving a common purpose. And I think this is really important because it's often enabled Aboriginal communities to do collective decision-making rather than decision-making by majority. And it really builds that sense of community cohesion. I also think that there's a lot to be said about Aboriginal culture as an oral culture. I think the importance of storytelling has also worked to build that sort of common purpose and identity and understanding of the world. And I think not only has that worked in terms of maintaining cultural traditions and stories, but I also think it's been used really successfully to build a resilience mindset. So I would say that as communities, we are great storytellers when it comes to stories of adversity, of endurance, of achievement, even in our contemporary world. And again, I think that's important for a number of reasons. Yes, absolutely, it builds our sense of identity, of collective identity, but I think it's also important in terms of healing and in pride and in allowing a community to reconnect through shared storytelling. I was looking at the weekend at some of the experts who were talking on, or who have researched community recovery from natural disasters. So looking at in other areas around floods and tsunamis, and what they've sought to identify is those kind of community characteristics that enable not only recovery, but recovery in an effective and timely way, in a way where people and communities are able to work together. And interestingly, the two key elements that came out of that were the importance of social links within a community. So the more interconnected a community is, the more it is able to band together and move forward through response and recovery. And the other important one is around shared histories. I think this was, for me, really encouraging in that I think it suggested Aboriginal communities are quite well placed to recover and to do so quite quickly. But I also think there's some really salient lessons here for public sector agencies. I think that when we look to recovery, it's going to be incredibly important that we don't just get stuck on economic recovery and kind of social service recovery, but that we really look at how it is that we can help to cultivate the kind of resilience traits that are exhibited by Aboriginal communities. And I think that's about focusing on how do we build interconnectedness in relationships, how do we build shared histories and storytelling. And I think those those less obvious ways of building community will become incredibly important as we move forward. In terms of, so I've spoken to the resilience, but it does strike me that talking about Aboriginal resilience without also acknowledging that the need for resilience is so ongoing because of ongoing inequity. What we have seen from a health perspective in terms of resilience is that Aboriginal communities have really endured wave after wave of introduced disease. So the COVID-19 pandemic is not the first of that. You know, it's well documented the impact of smallpox epidemics at the time of colonisation. You know, anecdotal or historical reports talk about 50 to 90% of death rate amongst Gadigal people in Sydney during that initial contact period. We've seen venereal diseases introduced, we've seen influenza, colds, tuberculosis, measles. So there is a real history there again of resilience in the face of quite significant sort of pandemics and epidemics. That said, what we have seen since colonisation has been policies that systematically disadvantage Aboriginal people, and we continue to see poor outcomes across a range of social and economic indicators. A lot of you may have seen in the news last week, the latest national agreement on closing the gap was finalised, and there's, you know, still just incredible inequity in terms of a lot of those sort of health outcomes that are set out in that agreement. And, you know, equity as such an important issue, and really reflecting on the long-standing inequity issues that relate, I suppose, if you like, to healthcare quality and access that has so often been denied First Nations people, and which has fueled, I think, poor outcomes across a range of indicators. The reason I raise this is I think what we have seen, what we've seen in Victoria in response to this pandemic is a real opportunity being seen by the Aboriginal community. So health inequity is nothing new. It's something that we have been talking about for a long period of time, that the last 10-year agreement on closing the gap really spoke to. We've seen a lot of work from key advocates talking about some of the concerns. For example, Australia is the only developed country in the world with endemic levels of trachoma, and it persists in remote Aboriginal communities. So we have discussions around that. We're conscious of comorbidities experienced by Aboriginal people. We know, for example, that in Victoria, any Aboriginal person aged over 50 is considered to be high risk of coronavirus in recognition of the poor health outcomes for Aboriginal people. That's a really incredible statistic if you think about the fact that we also live in, there's a tendency to live in intergenerational households. So what you have in Victoria is nearly every household, Aboriginal household in Victoria, will have someone who's considered at high risk of coronavirus. Really incredible statistics. But what is the opportunity here, and what I think has been seized as an opportunity, particularly by Aboriginal community controlled organisations, is a realisation that inequity is no longer just an Aboriginal issue. So health inequity, when we've been talking about it, even when we've been developing policy, it's kind of seen as policy in a vacuum, policy created for Aboriginal people by Aboriginal people. But what COVID-19 has really uncovered, I think, for everyone is that we are only as safe, we are only able to do outbreak prevention and minimisation. We are only able to do that if all of our marginalised communities experience a level of access to health care and health messaging. And so it's no longer enough to say, well, poor health outcomes is a terrible thing for Aboriginal communities. It's actually a terrible thing for all Victorians, for all Australians right now. And I think what we've seen is there's been no time lost in really trying to leverage off that understanding that we really do need to make sure we're developing policy and programmatic responses that speak to marginalised, that respond to marginalised communities. And I think this really leads me into, well, what does that mean for us in the public sector? What I think it means is, as we continue to do response work and as we're doing recovery work, it's not enough for us to take a sort of idea of responding to the community as though it's some sort of amorphous whole. There needs to be a real understanding that our communities are incredibly diverse, that we can't take a culture neutral approach to emergency management, because what we do know is if we don't message appropriately, if we don't speak in a way that resonates with, I'm talking here about Aboriginal communities, but I could equally be talking about marginalised communities, what we'll continue to see is outbreaks that will impact all of us. And so I think the real challenge here is to make sure that we are bringing marginalised voices into the fold. And I don't mean just at the point where we are delivering emergency responses, so not just in the implementation, but in the development and in the early decision making. Now, that's not something that we do naturally because, you know, we know cabinet decision making processes, but the failure to have those voices in the tent at that kind of crucial stage means that we won't necessarily get I think, the best and most salient advice that we could have from an Aboriginal perspective around how we reach Aboriginal communities, how we talk about outbreak prevention, how we talk about outbreak management, how we talk about social and economic recovery if we don't include that breadth of voices. And so I think the challenge for all of us is to be conscious that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to the work that we're doing, to really, where possible, establish respectful and trusted relationships as early as possible, and as a standard part of our practices, I think is going to be really, really crucial with Aboriginal people, with Aboriginal communities. I think really being conscious of the inherent strengths. We talked about Aboriginal resilience, but what can we take? What can we learn from Aboriginal resilience? What can we learn as well as in terms of service provision, but also how do we make sure that we are transferring decision-making power and resources to Aboriginal communities to be able to lead their own responses. And I think that's something that doesn't happen out of an Aboriginal Affairs policy team. Yes, we're important, but actually a lot of important decisions being made right now aren't being made through an Aboriginal lens. And so it's incumbent on all of us to think about those marginalised voices in that process. I'd be interested to see if we have
questions.
Any questions or comments or directions we'd like to take it.
Well, should we get started with some of the Q&A? And there's been some really great takeaways. I just wanted to reinforce that point that you just made about that we're only as safe as our marginalised communities and the nuance and like difference between those communities. So the most popular question that we have on this Q&A feed is from Jocelyn M. You may plan to touch on it later, but can you discuss what, if any, you have seen from the recent Black Lives Matter movement on Australia's understanding of and response to systemic oppression of First Nations people? Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, and I'm pleased to say we have some really pertinent research. So irrespective, as part of work on treaty, we've been sort of tracking community attitudes towards formalising decision-making with Aboriginal Victorians. We've also looked at how Victorians feel more broadly about the need to reckon with our past, if you like. So some of that truth-telling element. And as some of you will be aware, the Victorian government announced in the last month a commitment to a truth-telling process in Victoria. So that commitment actually coincided with the sort of Black Lives Matters movement and a lot of work that was going on in that area, and as well as some research that we actually had going on. I'm just moving my stuff so I'm plugged into next door a bit better. Some market research that we had falling within that period just by chance. What we've actually seen is a 10% upswing in people's in Victorians' commitment to formalising relationships between the state and Aboriginal people, and a 11% upswing in the number of people who think it's important that Victoria reckons with past wrongs and injustices committed against Aboriginal people. So we've felt it in a number of ways, but there does seem to be a momentum, and it's one I think that we're also sort of seeking to capitalise on right now.
I have a question, and I'm sorry, I will get to the other questions, but I guess you did your Masters in Human Rights and the Human Rights Charter, and I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer, so please excuse me if this sounds ignorant, but I guess the Constitution permits, or it's how the government, you know, works with us or runs us. I wonder, would there be any advantage to this, the idea that within the Constitution or within human rights that there's, I guess, positive laws that will be put into that, as well as, I mean, I don't want to say negative, but yeah, any kind of like positive reinforcement. Would you see that as an advantage?
Certainly, I'm always reluctant to say what a treaty in Victoria will contain, and I do that only out of respect for the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, who will represent Aboriginal Victorians in these negotiations, which have kicked off this morning, in fact. I was in the first treaty negotiation immediately before coming onto this panel. I'm reluctant to talk about what Victoria holds because I want to hold that space open for First Nations people here. But what I will say is if we look to Canada and we look to New Zealand, what we have seen and other jurisdictions is that there are opportunities through treaty making to actually bring through not just things that the state won't do against Aboriginal people, but as you say, positive rights. And I think for me, that's a really, as a human rights practitioner, it's one of the really exciting possibilities with treaties, what I would definitely say. And going off topic, but I think it's important, particularly for people earlier in their career, I will openly say that I had never had an intention necessarily of working in the public service. I trained as a lawyer and I worked as a commercial lawyer and then moved into academia and into human rights more broadly. And I came into the public service when treaty was announced in Victoria because I saw there was just incredible opportunity to make sure that there was a positive process and a process that could look at some of the best practice possibilities from international jurisdictions. And now having come into the public service, I cannot imagine not being in the public service. It has been for me an incredibly satisfying place to work in terms of being able to really put into practice some of these kind of academic or theoretical possibilities that I had studied for so long.
Yeah, I can only imagine, and it's good. It's refreshing even for somebody that doesn't work in the public service to hear that is a possibility, and that's something that you guys are all considering and kind of cooking up. Next question we have is from Karina Lee, and I feel like, you know, you did touch on this in your talk, but I will ask this: it's how can non-Aboriginal people leverage off of knowledge and experience of Aboriginal communities, but also appropriately compensate involvement and avoid accidental negative impacts on health or well-being?
I mean, this is the challenge, and it's a tension I think the government is grappling with at the moment because it's in a period of transition. So we've made this commitment to self-determination, and if we're talking about self-determination in its truest sense, self-determination is about the transfer of decision-making power and resources to the community. And so it would actually reduce the role of government in Aboriginal lives and in Aboriginal decision-making, and would also reduce the amount that we would need to, as public servants, leverage off the community to help to think through some of our policy and programmatic responses that we're responsible for. So what I would say is we should all be focused on an end goal where government doesn't have a role in Aboriginal decision making, and we should be looking at all times to support pathways forward that get us to that point. The reality is at the moment that we're in much more of a partnership or co-design phase than we are in a period of true self-determination. I think Karina, you're right in, I think one of it is understanding that we are leveraging off Aboriginal expertise and treating those expertise as experts. I think it's really quite incredible. I've worked in land management, for example, spaces or land management policy where we compensate well and we seek consultancy from land management expertise. But when it comes to Aboriginal cultural knowledge in the same area, we often don't compensate at all, or we compensate it to a much lesser degree. So one is acknowledging that issue, respecting it as expertise and talking about it as expertise. And then I think it's about making sure that rather than setting the question or setting the response from which we seek Aboriginal knowledge, that we actually enter into those kind of relationships asking, well, what's the question that we should be asking? Because I think as government, one of the things we often do with Aboriginal experts is set parameters that never really get the response that deals with Aboriginal culture, that deals with Aboriginal knowledge. What we ask is a series of metrics or questions that are very much framed in a Western conception of a problem. And in doing that, we've already lost the value of the expertise. So I think, the value there is setting the problem definition with communities.
Yeah, so that's I don't want to repeat what you said, but I feel like that's just going, what is it that we're asking in the bigger framework, rather than just educate us again about what it is that we already know the problems are. So let's try and tackle it together as a whole, like holistic thing. The next question we have is from Gio George. How do we learn from our past and ensure that minority groups aren't left behind from realising future prosperity? How do we build re-election into policy making? Re-election. Oh, I'm guessing he was saying reflection potentially into policy.
In terms of how do we learn from the past, I wish I knew the answer to that. Listen, I actually think this pandemic is one of those sort of, for me, maybe it's a bit of a watershed moment in terms of us learning. And I think the learning is ongoing right now, because I think emergency management is another area where we've tended to go with the sort of, I talked about a culturally neutral approach. And I think that's what it is. There is an emergency management framework and we implement it. And I actually think it's through the sort of significant impacts we're likely to see through how we engage with marginalised communities, and seeing that when we do that well, what we also see is much better outcomes, better ability to deal with outbreak management issues. I think that's going to be some of the stuff that resonates. My strong feeling is that we're dealing with a different conception in community about what's important than if we were talking a year ago. The importance of health, the importance of equitable responses and issues in health is absolutely paramount now. I know I was speaking in a professional context the other day about someone who was saying that a year ago they'd been involved in some decision making around around research supports and research resourcing, and was reflecting actually that they were quite proud that they'd made that investment a year ago, but that there's now much more of an understanding amongst public servants, amongst decision makers, about how important that early sort of investment is. And so I think I feel like the opportunity is now, and a lot of it is going to be showing value where value hasn't necessarily been seen before. There's never really been value in improving health inequity other than seeing it as a sort of benefactor relationship between government and Aboriginal people. And I think that's shifting, as I said in my opening remarks.
Yeah, I agree, and like to go back to your point that you were talking about how with health now there needs to be some kind of accessibility, and it needs to be communicated across minority groups. And that's one way of communicating with First Nations people and different with other minority groups who speak different languages, who are in different constraints. And this is really, you are so right, this is really a moment now more than ever to be reflecting on what our policies are moving forward. So and what we can do to ensure that they can withstand times like this.
I think what's really exciting right now is this is our evidence base. All of our responses right now are our evidence base around why it works. And we've often struggled in Aboriginal affairs to get that kind of clarity of evidence base, because often, you know, there's a multitude of factors and issues. But I think right now, because we're making such rapid decisions and we're seeing daily figures that change, you know, that tell us is something working or not, we'll be able to leverage off this sort of evidence base in terms of COVID-19 response into the future.
Oh yeah, there we go. It's clear again. And also just to say, just around like how different countries are managing themselves. Like we can see how the NT is managing this versus Victorians. I mean, I'm ambivalent to even use those kind of distinctions. So I'll say, you know, how Yolngu and how, you know, Gunai people are, you know, implementing this in changes to geography and the rapid response that there has been. It's incredible to watch the leadership that is born out of this. And as you have spoken so eloquently about the resilience that exists, because this is not the first time we as Aboriginal people have dealt with something like this. So thank you very much to George. From Pauline Van, a 3-day turnaround from when you advocated for First People door knockers to it becoming a reality is incredible. Nice work. When you were advocating for this, how did you describe the difference it would make?
Describe the difference it would make. I think we have almost I don't want to say standard set of lines, but we've been talking about self-determination so much in the Victorian government that we have developed a pretty clear evidence base that when you have Aboriginal-led approaches, they work. I think we've been able to demonstrate it probably through a lot of our comms work that we've done during the COVID-19 crisis, which is sort of showing we can't just use technical language and we can't just use all the same people. I think there's a general understanding that that is so in the Victorian government. There's work that's been done, I suppose, probably over the last 8 years to get us to a point where there is an understanding that you need bespoke approaches for communities and Aboriginal-led or community-led, marginalised group-led approaches. I think what it is often just reminding people when everyone is really busy not to forget to do that work. So some of it isn't the lack of, you know, it's not so much justifying it so much as saying to almost keeping a handle on what everyone's doing, saying, hang on, you're doing door knocking tomorrow on Monday? Right, well, where's our Aboriginal community controlled sector in all of this and how are we bringing them in? So it's more probably making the connections. I've not answered that very articulately, but yeah, it's a bit more complex than just what I said on the day. It's sort of been years of influence and work and changing attitudes and building acceptance that it's necessary.
So it's like all the work and all the broader work leads to answering the question of the difference that it would make. It's like I think that's another thing too, like all the experience that you have in and outside comes into these decisions from personal and lived experience to, you know, being public, corporate and government sectors. The next one, we have this again from Karina Lee. We probably cover this, but can you shed some light on how Aboriginal affairs policy and treaty areas have been using technology and virtual platforms given the current climate to ensure that Aboriginal communities are still involved in co-design and public policy processes?
Well, this is actually something that's been a really exciting find for me. So we've often, you know, community consultation or community engagement is really difficult as a process. I've actually found the opportunity to do things online has actually improved a lot of our engagement opportunities. We have people who are able to jump in for 5 minutes and have a conversation. I think we've been able to, in some ways, better regulate conversation. Doesn't that sound like government? But what I mean is we've been able to, I think, sort of Zoom and online platforms, they create almost like it's almost like that sort of sense of what's acceptable sharing of that resource and time, and everyone being there has really changed I suppose, engagement where sometimes you can have a couple of people kind of dominating conversations. I feel like, yeah, the online platform has really increased sort of equity and equitable participation across the board. So for me, we're using it frequently. The Aboriginal Community COVID-19 Task Force is completely online. It means that we're able to call them, if there's, restrictions in place on Saturday, we're able to call a meeting on Sunday and work through some of the issues. So for me, it's led to greater Aboriginal community engagement, and I think probably absolutely better responses because we do have that connect. So it's actually something I don't want to lose, even when we can meet in person. I think there's some real advantages that we need to work out how we harness.
Yeah, it's like the democratic kind of, you have the talking stick window right now.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I have also noticed that people will wait their turn to kind of before, so they have to really listen to what's happening and then also think before they speak, and that's so nice to see.
Yeah, and I have to acknowledge I have a tendency to think I often know best in conversations and dominate, and it's really caused me to sort of stop and reflect, and I'm sure it's done the same for other people. So
yeah, and also because you're looking at the screen of how many people there are in there and who you haven't heard from. So to say, hey, we haven't heard from you for a while, can we hear your opinion? Yeah, it's a process. So from anonymous attendee, how do you feel we can work to reconcile the lack of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representation in public service? When the government has been an oppressor for such a long time, is there a...
Yeah, listen, it's something I struggle with. It's something I spend a lot of time thinking about, and also not just thinking about, trying to build our sort of, I think it's also our succession planning. How are we investing in people early in their career? How are we making sure that we're providing them with opportunities? The public service is such a hard space. I was talking to another Aboriginal executive, because we often lean on each other for support, and he said, going to the idea of government historically as oppressor, it's almost that being in government is inherently in tension with cultural values. It's almost working within the system, trying to change it, and so it's a tough place for a lot of Aboriginal people. I think we still haven't necessarily nailed how we value the expertise that Aboriginal people are bringing to the table. I feel like often success is predicated on being able to do both the standard business as usual way of doing government, as well as trying to just quietly and gently influence with Aboriginal perspectives. So I think, how do we get to a point where we're actually celebrating Aboriginal knowledge and Aboriginal value? And I think that still requires a lot of work. I think that's the systemic change that's underway, because we haven't actually brought Aboriginal cultural value into the way we do funding, the way we make programmatic decisions, the way we evaluate programmatic decisions. So until we do that work, I think it's a work in progress to make the public service not only attractive to Aboriginal people, but somewhere where they feel safe and supported and can thrive being who they are.
Yeah, it's such I think about that from, I guess, like a cultural perspective of working within like the arts sector, and then having to always be aware of, no matter what, there is this cultural responsibility and duty, no matter what realm you are in, to your, not only to, your employer and the broader public, but also to your own community. And that's a real awareness of like managing the dual expectations of your own and the broader public sector, and the kind of, I guess, that to reiterate that all Aboriginal people have different ways that they would like things to proceed, and that's a nuanced conversation and thing as well, their own governance within their own countries and communities. We have Kylie. When enabling Aboriginal voices within a policy environment, how can non-Aboriginal policy officers strengthen this process and be inclusive within their work environment?
Sorry, I missed the first bit of that question.
Oh, sorry. From Kylie, when enabling Aboriginal voices within a policy environment, how can non-Aboriginal policy officers strengthen this process and be inclusive within their work environment?
Sure. This is something I think that needs to be done very carefully. I think it's really important to remember the complexity of Aboriginal voices in a community. There isn't a homogenous voice. There isn't a single source of truth. And so that's something I think that's really important, is that we make sure that we're being inclusive and representative when we're engaging, that we spend a bit of time interrogating who we're engaging with and making sure that it reflects the breadth of community voice. I think that's something that is learnt over time, and it's learnt through the development of relationships. So for me, that's the really important and key thing, is to be constantly critically assessing and thinking really deeply about, am I making sure and getting an Aboriginal perspective, that I'm not just getting a single Aboriginal perspective, but that what I'm doing is building in the diversity of voice and perspectives, and also being comfortable with the fact that there isn't always, as there isn't in the broader Victorian population, a single right answer on what it is to have an Aboriginal program or policy developed. You might have some people who agree and you'll have other people who don't agree. And I think we need to all get comfortable with that as we do. You know, no one expects that everyone is happy with general policy that's developed. So we shouldn't put that burden on Aboriginal people to have a consensus view of the world either.
Yeah, agreed so wholeheartedly. Like, and that there is always space for critical discussion with our Aboriginal people, and that, you know, that needs to be encouraged as well, like amongst ourselves, as well as when we are in the, you know, throes of making policy decisions. Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Kylie. We have two more left. Stephanie Gout. Health access for all is something incredibly important and has been thrown into sharp relief recently. How could current policy-making programs responding to COVID-19 be more widely rolled out?
Yeah, it's something we've been reflecting on. So I'll talk from the Aboriginal perspective, because that's sort of what I'm obviously deeply working in. The Aboriginal community COVID-19 task force has been developed, and one of their suggestions was to have Aboriginal local response networks. And so their networks opening at a local level, their kind of geographic spread is up to the local area, up to the local group, but they're open and inclusive spaces for all Aboriginal community members to bring any issues. So I've been thinking of them almost as a clearinghouse, so you can bring in and raise issues, and what the intention is where there's an existing response or existing program, the issue gets referred, and then what we have is an escalation. So if there's no current response to an issue, for example, you know, culturally safe accommodation for people in an emergency situation, if we look around and we see that there's nothing there, what we've got now is an elevation point. And I think one of the differences with the task force, when things are elevated to the task force, is that we have representatives from across government sitting on that task force and making those referrals in real time. So rather than having siloed responses, one response for health, another for education, and they all sit separately, it's brought it all together. And so we're able to finally make those connections, perhaps that aren't always as obvious when you're working in a more siloed departmental response. So, you know, we've been reflecting on what are the lessons we can learn here about more joined up outcomes-based decision-making and oversight to make sure that we're not just trying to do sort of simplified responses that respond to one part of an issue, when an Aboriginal person's lived experience is not just, you know, neatly bundling education and health outcomes into two separate areas and never the twain shall meet. Yeah. Has there been
any kind of surprising I guess link-ups when you have been tackling that you were like, oh, we can really see clearly how these departments should be talking to each other more?
I think some of there's so many. I mean, one of the ones that comes to mind almost immediately is the connection point between DHHS around child and family services and education. And particularly as we moved into online education, the importance that a lot of vulnerable families may sort of, I suppose, disengage from school, but would sort of land often in those sort of social service supports that are available. And so how do we actually create networked systems so that people don't fall through the cracks no matter where they show up, if that makes sense. So we've been able to do some of that work to kind of build in referral pathways back to a particular department by really leaning in on all of our existing networks and trying to bring them together.
Yeah, I am really feeling for people within YIPAA and broader communities who are homeschooling at the moment, and really trying to keep that engagement going, and also to our teachers as well, really getting kids involved in that as a family. Okay, we've got last question. I mean, I still have a few more questions as well from, Matthew. Do you believe that the marginalised approach assists with addressing broader systemic issues with broader policy creation, particularly a more inclusive resolution to issues for every Victorian?
Yeah, I have been working really hard to interrogate this idea of inclusion and what inclusion means for the Victorian government. So I think inclusion, when the idea is to build access, is great, and inclusion where we're trying to make sure that universal services are culturally appropriate for different groups is important. I think though sometimes inclusion has been able to kind of hide the importance of making sure that we have service responses that are actually appropriate for marginalised groups, which means that it needs to be different for different people. So for me, there is a need to acknowledge marginalised groups, and I will always be careful to say marginalised, not vulnerable, because I think there's a narrative in that as well, a tendency to refer to Aboriginal people as vulnerable, and we're not inherently vulnerable, but certainly there's a vulnerability as a result of marginalisation. And I think we need to talk about marginalised communities, because if we fail to kind of acknowledge marginalised communities and then think about what it is from a marginalised perspective that is missing from a universal response, if we don't do that, we'll continue to put out sort of culturally neutral policy that will by its very nature exclude marginalised groups like Aboriginal people who don't see themselves reflected in what the offering is. And so I think it's part of how we deal with inequity.
Mm-hmm. And to know that, you know, as soon as we are thinking not culturally neutral and involving this like plane of access, that actually it's serving the greater community and the greater Victorian public sector if we are helping our marginalised communities. Yes, I'm also very aware not to say vulnerable. We'll have to.
I think that's important, because we're making the investment for people anyway. So it's not really about, it's really about making the appropriate investment in the appropriate places rather than questioning whether investment needs to happen at all.
Yeah, totally. I'm interested, do you have, for some of the younger people that are going into the public sector, reflecting on your time between, you know, government, corporate and public, any advice for people going into that now? After you've been in a few different sectors?
Absolutely. I think what I would say is don't be afraid to back yourself is something that's really important. I think hierarchy doesn't dictate your ability to bring interesting things to the table. And I think it's really important that we don't get in a mindset of I'm just a VPS 3, I'm just a VPS 4, I'm just a VPS 5, and sort of limiting our role. I think obviously what you want to be able to do is hone those skills of influence and making sure that you're influencing decision makers, but don't be afraid to share. This is my personal perspective and something I'm very keen on in my branches, and I hope if there's anyone from my branches here, they would concur. But I think I really value being tested sometimes, or at least hearing different views on how we might attack a policy problem. And so I think that's really important. I also think there's a billion different ways to skin a cat. I've in terms of career progression and development, and don't think that there just needs to be a single traditional pathway. And I talked about the fact, I was a I was a lawyer first. I was also, well, actually, I had my daughter who you saw walk past before. I had her when I was 20. So I went through law school and my arts degree with her, and I tried different things, and I you know, didn't finish in a linear pattern, and I came into the public service at only 4 years ago. I came into the public service, and I came in as a VPS 5. And I didn't understand the public service or how it worked. And I had worked as a lawyer, and I sort of felt a little bit frustrated that a 5 was a role where I didn't feel much influence. And so going back to that thing of sort of backing yourself and making sure that you're not just limiting yourself to your role, but having those conversations and showing where your value is, I think can help with that progression. I've rambled, but I think it's important to know there's lots of different ways to get there.
Yeah, and I think that's really great, because it's also, I mean, not just for people entering into the sector, but then also for people that have been in the sector. It's like, how can we really challenge our younger and newer members and hear what they have to say, so we can continue to be nimble in our thinking?
Yeah.
Which I think is important.
Yeah. And I think there's a certain, and don't be afraid of reinvention. Like, I think sometimes, as I did when I came into the public service, you take a step back to take, 2 steps, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I think don't be afraid of change. And if there's an opportunity that you can see presenting itself, but it might require a step back or a step sideways, I think don't be afraid of that if it gets you closer to the kind of work that you enjoy.
Elly, I feel like we've had such a rich discussion this morning, and thank you so much. For me, I know that on a personal note, even though I don't necessarily work in the public sector, it was amazing to be reminded of the resilience of First Nations people to adapt to things. And I feel like I'm walking away from this talk thinking about that. And also I really loved your point on the fact that we are only as good as the access that we provide to our marginalised communities. There's really so many great takeaways from this, and that we can't be culturally neutral on things. So thank you so much. I just wanted to have just a note, is that the transcription on the Edge browser will be available on Mac and PC only. I think that's all right. And look, thank you everyone for joining today. I really hope that you'll be able to attend other masterclass events, and I strongly encourage you to look at the program. An honour to be here hosting, and I just want to give a round of applause wherever you are. Thank you so much. And look, we do have one more video for all of us to, I guess, conclude this talk. I just want to say thank you again to all of our partners for supporting this masterclass series, and a huge thank you to Elly Patira.
No, thank you everyone for the really great questions as well.
Awesome. And look, we've got a lot of things coming through on the chat as well. Kylie, I will hand over to you to play the last video that will send us out for today. And look, thank you once again.
Hi, my name is Miles Hutchison.
And I'm Sean Bardwell.
And we want to tell you about the 2020 YIPAA Masterclass Series, Change Agency. I've spent the past 2 years volunteering with the YIPAA Committee and am its current chair.
And I was on the committee for the last 3 years, was chair for 2 of those, and I'm now the Masterclass Series lead.
YIPAA, or Young IPAA, is IPAA Victoria's community for early career professionals, including anyone under 36 working in local, state or Commonwealth government and the organisations that support them. Our committee works with IPAA Victoria to coordinate events and opportunities that help those early career professionals to do 3 important things: to connect, building professional networks and a stronger community of peers; to learn about key issues affecting the public purpose sector and developing the skills to manage those; and to grow, developing into confident, connected and capable leaders ready to support the sector and the wider Victorian community. It goes without saying that this year has seen extraordinary change. This Masterclass series then will be a key opportunity for those early career professionals to connect, learn and grow while preparing to navigate that change.
We know that there is untapped potential in early career professionals right across the sector that could be mined to support a public purpose sector that is more excited, engaged and passionate about public service. To achieve this, our mission has been to accelerate the growth of the YIPAA network, which has included increasing the frequency of our initiatives and delivery of our flagship event for 2020, the YIPAA Masterclass Series, Change Agency. The Masterclass Series has been designed as a 4-week intensive that covers an expansive range of topics, from Aboriginal affairs in the 21st century to responding to COVID and bushfire crises and having a look at what data and cybersecurity hold for us in the future. We've designed each of the 4 weeks so you can explore 4 different aspects of change that experienced public purpose sector professionals have to master in their careers. These include reflecting on change, anticipating change, responding to change, and affecting change.
Over the 4 weeks, we'll deliver over 20 individual events, led by over 30 highly regarded leaders and change agents, all experts in affecting change in the public purpose sector. These will include keynotes, masterclasses and workshops. In addition, we've also developed a networking initiative, Coffee with the Change Agent sessions, and access to Deloitte's Delve for Gov platform, which is brimming with useful resources.
We're so excited about having designed such an amazing program with so many inspiring speakers.
A special thanks to IPAA Victoria and to our volunteer YIPAA committee for designing and delivering a really exciting program.
We would also like to acknowledge the generous support from our major partner, the Victorian Public Sector Commission, and our partners, the Victorian Managed Insurance Authority and Deloitte, who have made the Masterclass series a reality and who continue to support early career professionals in the public purpose sector. If you haven't already done so, check out all the YIPAA Masterclass series change agency events and speakers at the IPAA Victoria website at vic.ipaa.org.au.
We're really looking forward to seeing you at the events through this month. And don't forget to join us on LinkedIn afterwards for post-event discussions. See you there.
We'll see you there.
And to all of our participants today, and thank you also to Elly Patira and our partners. We look forward to seeing you at our next YIPAA Masterclass series. Until then, stay safe.